On today's episode of the Black Studies Podcast, we had the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Mark B. Campbell, DJ, scholar, and curator. His research explores the relationships between Afrosonic innovations, hip-hop archives, and notions of the human. Dr. Campbell is currently the principal investigator in the SSHRC-funded research project, Black Sonic Knowledges, Amplifying Black Canadian Musical Legacies, and founder at Northside Hip-Hop Archive. He leads the Afrosonic Innovation Lab, a team of artists, creatives, and scholars actively engaged in sound experimentation, music making, and musicological analysis across the African diaspora. His recent books include the monograph Afrosonic Life, the co-edited collection of essays We Still Hear, Hip-Hop in North of the 49th Parallel, and the co-edited collection Hip-Hop Archives, the Politics and Poetics of Knowledge Production with Murray Forman in 2023. Dr. Campbell is Associate Professor of Music and Culture and Associate Chair, Research and Creative Practice in the Department of Art, Culture, and Media at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Black Studies Podcast. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Mark B. Campbell, Associate Professor of Music and Culture and Associate Chair, Research and Creative Practice in the Department of Art, Culture, and Media at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. How are you doing today, Dr. Campbell?
Oh, I'm great this morning. Thank you for the invitation, Ashley.
Well, thank you so much for being here. Let's dive in with how you got into Black Studies and what keeps you committed to doing that type of work.
How did I get into Black Studies? I would say, I think the easiest way to begin is like what I did as an undergraduate. But I think backing up a little bit before that was thinking about learning and pedagogy and, being a kid and learning hip hop in the early 90s, like I started DJing in 94, there was no institution that could teach you. You had to figure out how to learn. And I see that as essential to thinking about Black study, about the failure or the inadequacy of actual institutions to advance how Black life acquires knowledge, produces knowledge, disseminates knowledge. So thinking about that ethic of like trying to figure out how to learn something. With your peers, with mentors, by yourself, through observation, etc. And I think part of that ethic I took to the university when I arrived as an undergraduate because there was no Black Studies program. And I was hungry to learn more about my culture. And the university that I was at had a strong Caribbean studies program. And my family's Jamaican, I'm Jamaican. And that was a great starting point for me, but there wasn't a Black Studies program. So it could have been African American literature. It could have been a course on race and racism. It could have been a bunch of different courses in different departments. So I took courses in sociology, political science, history, and then I created my own degree. And it was an individualized study degree with a focus on the African diaspora. Which was mind-blowing in the late 90s because the individualized program was really like underutilized. Students went in and they're like, I'm going to be a psychology major or whatever. And they follow this linear path. But I feel like I walked into that space with the ethic of, I got to do for self. I got to figure out how these things work. And I'm not going to take the degree that they give me. I'm going to make my own degree so that it serves my purposes. And, so for me, the journey in Black Studies began that way, without any formal program. A lot of the scholars in Canada, where I'm located, in Black Canada, they were teaching in different areas in the university, and it was really about before we had the language of the undercommons. It was about subterfuge. Get in there, figure out which programs have what courses, find the right professor, and then build a degree that works for yourself. So I think that's kind of how I ended up thinking and doing and living Black study, and intimately connected to like being a DJ and being in hip hop and finding ways to continuously try to learn. In those days in the 90s, we were learning through video cassette sometimes. We would watch other DMC competitions, or you would be at an event and you would just keenly observe what the older DJs were doing and that sort of thing. So I think that's part of how I come to Black Studies, decentering the institution.
Thank you. So building on that, how do you situate yourself in relationship to discipline? Because you did make your own degree.
Yeah.
You've got hip hop studies, we've got Black studies, we've got figuring it out. Um,
Mm.
but in the institution, they are like the goal of the most departments and programs in the institution is to fit you into a box, or at least allow you to be able to fit into a box.
Yeah.
So how do you situate yourself in relationship to the multiple disciplines and fields that your work speaks?
That's a great question. I feel like this is the question that you ask before you go on the job market when you're a grad student and you got to figure these things out. I did an undergraduate degree in education and went to teachers college, and was teaching during grad school at the high school level, the intermediate senior level, and then I did a master's in history, in social history, Caribbean social history. And I was just massively disappointed by the entire discipline at the time. And it was one of those things where even if I wanted to study hip hop, nobody would take it seriously and nobody would advise that. And the department is unbelievably, at least in the school that I was at the time, was unbelievably conservative. So I did that degree and then I left history because I was really unhappy with the field, and education was working as a field for me. But even the conversations around hip hop education hadn't started. This is 99, 2000, 2001. Um, and I was still committed to not losing sight of my artistic self and,
Mhm.
the whole self that you bring to the academy. So I kept sort of muddling my way around into different disciplines. And I moved into, when I got to graduate school, I did a graduate degree in education and equity studies, which gave me the latitude. That's where I did my PhD. It gave me the latitude to think about my training as an educator, what I'm doing in the classroom pedagogically, but also thinking about how one learns, right? I'm always interested in how one learns. How does one learn to not consume hip hop, but to participate in hip hop? How does one learn the art forms, the windmill? How do you learn to get the right bubble letters? All that sort of stuff has always been interesting to me. So by the time I graduated with my PhD, I had I had degrees in four different fields. So the discipline for me, I always seen disciplines as prove to me that you could advance what I need to advance as a scholar, because those disciplines should work for us, right? Rather than me working for the discipline. And that was always the way to approach the potential harm of like having a discipline you, so that your worldview can only be, insert discipline here. Your worldview can only be economic. Your worldview can only be geographic. Your worldview could only be aesthetic or political in terms of political science. And part of the unwillingness to kind of leave the artistic self was to always center what does hip hop offer? Well, you know, I'm coming at it from an angle as a DJ, and someone also interested in visual arts, but thinking about the multimodal forms. Why has hip hop offered me so much? It's ocular, it's sonic, it's kinesthetic. These ciphers are about community and collaboration and competition. So always thinking through like, what is the paradigm that offered me something to get me to where I'm at? And refusing disciplines has been part of the work of like trying to stay whole, or trying to ensure that your subjectivity exists with a certain amount of autonomy, um obviously with relationality, but with a certain amount of autonomy, because the institution will make you work for it,
Mhm.
right? And our job really should be to make the institutions work for us. So like finding a discipline that allowed me to think about the economic impact, the geographic impact, the aesthetic and sonic impact of these art forms, umbrellaed under hip hop. Here I'm including like beatboxing, and I'm thinking about tagging as different than graffiti, etc. Um, yeah, trying to find a way to exceed these disciplines. So like cultural studies became a home for me in terms of thinking about power and culture. Obviously, people like Kwabena Mercer, Stuart Hall, uh, Julian Henriquez much later on. These folks are all critical in thinking about how disciplines can discipline us, and building on even more recent work, thinking about discipline as empire, like Catherine McKittrick tells us this in Dear Science, and thinking about how to evade those workings. When on my very first day of my PhD studies, my advisor, who was absolutely brilliant and kind to me and like set the paradigm, Ronaldo Walcott, Dr. Ronaldo Walcott, he literally said, and I'll never forget these words to me and another colleague. He said, "Don't let the PhD de-skill you." And recognizing that myself and Lyndon, who was also in the cohort, we came with specific skills that were nurtured outside the university. And I had not started curating at the time, but I was on radio, I was DJing and performing and deeply involved in hip hop in a bunch of different ways in Toronto. Uh, and that message stuck with me because it was about um, working with disciplines that advance what you bring to the table already rather than having the discipline work on you, so that either reduces your analytical capabilities, or it encourages you to divorce yourself from some of the subjective and organic pieces that you bring to the table as a thinker and a producer and a creative.
Thank you. There was a lot that you said in that I think is interesting in terms of how you worded it, but really speaks to the importance of being able to take what you need from different spaces to do the work and answer the questions. Like a lot of people that have been on the podcast have spoke about like taking whatever methods are necessary to answer the questions and to center Black ways of knowing, regardless of the discipline that they were formally trained in. But I really
Yeah,
think that idea of not letting the PhD or this process that they make you go through to, de-skill you is so important because you do come with so many skills
yeah,
to the process, but in many ways it is like I tell my sister all the time because she's working on her PhD, it's a hazing process. Like, it is very much break you down, make you think in certain ways, or try to get you to think in certain ways that maybe that's not what is necessary to answer the questions that you want to explore in a way that continues to center and focus on Black ways of knowing, um, when you're doing the work of Black studies. So thank you for that.
yeah,
I also think that really lends itself to a conversation we were having before we started recording regarding the intersections or conversations around hip hop studies and Black studies specifically.
yeah,
So we can continue having that conversation now. And whether or not there is as much interaction between those two, at least explicitly, um, as there could be.
yeah. I'm curious to think about hip hop studies as it evolves as a subfield, and the ways that you know um, for many reasons, Black studies and its analytical tools don't seem to speak to the folks that are working in hip hop, and I think it could and it should. There's questions around you know, some of the leading hip hop scholars in America and the United States are thinking about hip hop in this post commodified moment. That's not even the right term. I would really, since it's become globally dominant, since it's become commercially dominant, having these conversations about, you know, how did hip hop not arrive at the place we imagined it was going to in the late 80s and 90s when it was in conversation with the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, when it was in conversations with questions around mineral extraction and power imbalances, like, so, I think we had envisioned a different kind of future for hip hop, and part of the conversation that I think needs to happen is a conversation around racial capitalism and thinking about the ways in which not only has we can't even say hip hop, we have to say rap. The
Yeah.
ways in which hip hop culture has been um, divvied up into commodifiable forms so that, when K Slay passes away, that's when you learn, that he was an amazing graffiti artist. That's when the general public starts to understand that. But when he is DJ K Slay and he's releasing albums and all those sort of things, record labels aren't trying to promote him as a legendary graffiti artist or a hip hop artist. They have these commodifiable forms, and it's the CD or the album or whatever. Um, and I feel like Black studies should be part of that conversation, and and be able to talk from uh, a politically Black perspective about what is happening to hip hop, um, and what are the mechanisms and analytical tools that we can bring to that conversation to give us a different future around what hip hop could possibly bring to the table. And I will say this, being outside of the United States of America, like I'm born and raised in Canada, and seeing hip hop look very different in this country over all of the years that I've been involved is a critical part of the conversation around where hip hop is going and what happened to hip hop and why is Sotheby's, why are they auctioning off hip hop memorabilia from Cool Herc, and why do we, there's these
Yeah.
conversations that could be happening in hip hop um, outside of the United States that is happening, you know, um, in places like Sweden, in places like Kenya, in places like Cape Town or Montreal. I think those need to be part of the conversation. I think there's a piece, because I've worked in so many different disciplines. There's a way in which the study of hip hop can be enhanced not just by Black studies, but an intersection of diaspora studies and thinking about
Mhm.
how people move with hip hop
Yeah.
and how hip hop moves, right? There's a kind of media imperialism that allows hip hop to get to France and get to Tokyo and get to these other places through wild style and other forms of media. And those conversations are like need to be had to understand why kids in Rio de Janeiro want to do hip hop in 2025, 2026, or why hip hop can still have a grasp for kids in Mongolia and how they arrive at hip hop. So there's so many different questions that I feel like that would be lovely to have. There's questions to have, but questions to wrestle with in that space. And I would, of course, there's really great work already happening in hip hop, and part of, I feel like the one of the contributions that I'm making now is thinking about this decolonial turn and thinking about the archiving of hip hop. So the last book that myself and Murray Forman edited, Hip Hop Archives, the politics and poetics of the production of knowledge. I probably got that all wrong, but that book was really eye-opening in terms of thinking about what's happening in Russia and how is the state involved and libraries involved in the preservation of hip hop culture and what are the tools we're bringing to it. It's not just we had great conversations with many archivists and librarians, but again, that's one institution that the hip hop never needed the library or the archival sciences to exist. And why is that the only mechanism by which we're trying to think about preserving hip hop? You know, so those are the great conversations. I feel like from a Black studies lens, you know, uh, thinking critically about discipline
Mhm.
and thinking about these categories and utilizing kind of understanding late capital and its racial connections. Uh, all that thinking needs to be brought into how we're thinking about the moment of, the archival moment, the archival turn in hip hop, which is not just about archives, but now it's about there's television shows. I mean, LL Cool J is dealing with memorabilia, and there's so much interesting things happening in that moment. But the analytical tools need to be brought to it from a bunch of different disciplines to ensure it's robust and that race is at the center of it and that blackness remains at the center of understanding hip hop culture.
Thank you. I think it's the archiving of hip hop is very interesting right now. And just the role of archiving in general. Like, I think that that turn has definitely happened, um, in hip hop and the way that we think about hip hop studies, but it's also happening more broadly, like, where people are archiving or doing, archival work
Mhm.
in a way that, on the one hand, might have been possible before, right? Like, the ability of the ability to have conversations across great spaces and great, l distances, at
Yeah,
this point is much different. The ability to find things that have been digitally archived, the ability to, um, put things into conversation and put pieces together that formerly would have required you to go to specific locations in a way that is not to say you shouldn't, but you don't necessarily have to anymore, right? Like, you can
yeah,
talk to archivists who are and librarians in Russia and not necessarily have to travel to Russia to do so in the same ways that you might have 30 years ago. Um, but I do think that it's interesting that we had this moment where there was a lot of, and maybe it's a reflection of, as you said, like, the commodification and commercialization of it, because just like, I mean, the academy mirrors many aspects of broader society, and right? And so I think that just like hip hop became very commercially viable and profitable for select groups of people, arguably hip hop studies became commercially viable and profitable for a select group of scholars for a
yeah.
particular moment in time. And not to say that the scholars in hip hop studies were by and large doing it because of that, right? Like, they did it when that wasn't the case. But
Yeah.
there was like this really big push, especially around like hip hop in the intersection of education, in a way
Mhm.
that I think is not necessarily happening in the same ways because of the discrepancy between where people imagined hip hop going and where we see like mainstream rap conversations now, or the mainstream songs now.
Yep. Yep. And one other piece I'll add to that is um, it's not just where it's going mainstream, but also, well, I'll say this: I just spent this part of the reason why scheduling this was not so easy for me is that I was hosting the Black Study Summer Seminar, which is a program that I helped found alongside Kristen Mariah, and this year we focused on digital capture. So one of the things about this whole conversation around the preservation of hip hop and the archiving of hip hop and the accessibility and the global possibilities of the kinds of conversations we can have, there are some amazing scholars like Safia Noble and Ruha Benjamin and others that are reminding us that the digital space is fraught and that there's so many problems with just digitizing and creating hip hop collections online. Um, and these are conversations happening even before the moment of AI, where AI can scrape everything off the net and offer if you and is trained, right?
Yeah.
Think about what kind of music or what kind of access trains AI when you're thinking about hip hop culture. It is not, it's going to be extracted words and imagery from anywhere on the net that is completely out of context, hasn't, it's a hyperlocal form. where if you're in Houston, you gotta know what side that you're speaking on. You know what I mean? And if you're in a city like Toronto, we have East and West End, and we have very different kinds of hip hop scenes in a little tiny city like Toronto. So, being cognizant that like the folks that can access hip hop and aren't in a community or aren't a practicing artist or aren't contributing to that art form can have access to anything globally, hip hop lyrics, visuals, anywhere, and take them out of context. And another reason why we need to be thinking, be asking these difficult questions about, you know, the the turn of AI and what does this mean for preservation of hip hop? Because once you pull it out of its context and you decontextualize it, people can say anything and all things about it.
Yeah.
And until someone proves to me that, AI or the ways in which people might want to use hip hop, if you can't find Exhibit's song where he's on Foundation, where he's talking about his son, or you can't find Ed OG and be a father to your child, those joints, if you can't put those in conversations with all of the things that upset us, the things that, that are properly construed in other media platforms, until those things are in conversation, we have to be worried about how people approach hip hop, what is their access to it, and what are they utilizing it for, especially at this, I would say in not just in the archival turn, but with the advent of not just AI, but now quantum AI and the speed in which we can't even get our books published fast enough before 5 or 6 editions of Chat GPT are released.
Yeah.
So it changes everything. But I wanted to throw that out there because now, like, if you want to study hip hop, um, you have to be in conversation with people like Brock and Noble and Ruel Benjamin, and helping us think about what is happening in front of our eyes. Why, you know, something like Rap Genius can get $25 million to literally sort of extract elements of hip hop and make it accessible to people. You know,
Yeah, I think that the point about context and so much of hip hop being locally dependent and derived is so important because it is like if you lose the context, so much is lost in that translation.
yeah,
Whether that translation is literal or figurative in terms of the hip hop that exists in other spaces and other countries. But yeah, I guess the ideas or the digitally archiving and what that means for not just the accessibility of individuals, but the accessibility of technologies that are extractive by nature and that are
yeah,
being paid, not just to extract, but also extracting natural resources from communities in order to do that work. That is a really important conversation to have.
yeah. There is something to be said about the hyperlocalness of hip hop, and wherever it ends up speaking to local concerns, speaking to real people where they are embedded, and not some sort of global or corporately designed notion of what one should talk about, what one should be interested in. So that is such a ripe space. But in terms of how I'm thinking about Black studies, I'm thinking about why that conversation is not as ripe as I would love it to be.
Yeah. And yeah, if it was more robust,
Yeah.
or more overtly, happening more overtly or more visibly, because the
Mhm.
conversations are happening, but they're not necessarily happening in the ways that they could be happening, and in spaces where people are talking about these things, perhaps at the level that they should be. But I mean, that's the importance of regionality in Black studies, like, having that conversation would be really
Yeah.
helpful, right? Like, you can't talk about Black studies you can't talk about the importance of Black studies without thinking about the importance of location.
Yeah.
Um, and the work that's happening in specific locations, which parallels and influences the hip hop that developed in specific locations. Um, so yeah, that's another important component, that locality piece for both.
There are many great micro histories of hip hop, in places like Seattle, New Orleans,
Mhm.
Atlanta. Once you start putting those things together, when you start reading across these different books, and like I got to shout out everybody that have been working on these micro histories of like hip hop in a particular city, the textures become so much more palatable. You start to really be able to read across what's happening in the culture that's very, very different than what you're seeing at the level of like streaming platforms or at the level of some sort of universal music and all these other pieces. So it's like we had this movement, I would say about a decade ago in Canada, in Toronto, well, actually in Canada, around local news and just how important local news was. And it went from, a professor I was working with at my old institution. She brought her concerns as a journalism professor to Ottawa, right, to our capital, to the prime minister, basically. And they realized that like local news is critical to healthy communities, right? To be able to know what's going on in your local community. I think about hip hop exactly the same way and thinking about how central it is to be able to not just hear what's happening or see what's happening in a specific location, but to offer the platform for people to enunciate their own experiences in relation to the north side of their city or the east side of their city or their specific community in a larger, in a 10
Mhm.
million person city. We all know about Queensborough and Queensbridge for a reason, and Staten Island for a reason. And that those things I think are critical in terms of understanding hip hop's potentialities.
Thank you. So building on that, because we also spoke a little bit about the Rhymes to Re-Education, which was a hip hop education um organization, and I know I have their book, and I went to their conference 11 years
Nice.
ago. Um, but how is your work as a teacher? And you have been both not both a higher ed instructor and professor, obviously, but also like a K-12 teacher. How does your work as a teacher and scholar informed by both Black studies and hip hop studies?
Yeah, that's a great way for me to really think about. I've taught like grade 7 all the way up to teachers ed programs. So, and I've also designed curriculum at the provincial level and worked on textbooks, etc. So, in terms of the how I as an educator, I mean, Walter Rodney's really influential in my thinking groundings, and thinking about what happens. Also, being of Caribbean ancestry, thinking about what groundation means, what it means to be in community and talking to people, uh, and thinking about ideas with people outside of formal structures. So, in the classroom, I like to think about the work that I do as helping people develop a praxis that's just not about getting good grades, um, or a praxis that's not just about some linear trajectory to get you the job that you want, but a way of living in the world that, honors your ancestors, uses your critical faculties. So when I'm in the classroom, the Black radical tradition is for me is about offering people the tools to be able to do to take the power away from the classroom, to make learning happen everywhere, on the subway, on your bicycle, at the convenience store, and thinking about, oh, this is a tool that I developed and I sharpened in class, and I need to utilize that tool right now in this moment where we're on the street and we're protesting and we're thinking about police surveillance and all these other pieces. So I think part of my investment sort of in the pedagogical possibilities that Black Studies opens up is thinking about uh, the sharpening of tools and the decentering of the classroom as the place where one should learn. And thinking about the classroom in many ways, I've never really written about my pedagogical practice, but if I were to offer one now, I would think about the classroom as a rehearsal, as a practice session, as a place where you sharpen your tools, right? Where we should be able to ask questions, ask difficult questions, sit with those questions, maybe not find answers for the questions, but sharpen the skill of asking questions. Because that in my classroom, I offer my students the possibility of imagining that your questions are more important than your answers.
Mm.
And you think about, I do a lot of sports, and I think about, when you're practicing, if you're a baseball pitcher and you're practicing your curveball or your fastball or whatever, or your slider, the classroom is where you practice these things to be deployed in other places so that I would never want I wouldn't be honoring my ancestors if I was sitting in a classroom and assuming that this hegemonic space is where all learning happens, you know? Knowing that for many of our ancestors that didn't have access to these classrooms, and I'm thinking specifically of rural Jamaica, where my family's from, there was tons of learning happening in the grass, in the trees, observing the sky, smelling. Like there's so many different ways that we produce knowledge about our surroundings that have allowed for healthy and sustained lives for
Mhm.
hundreds of years that I take that into the classroom and I'll be like, yeah, this is a place where maybe we'll argue, maybe we won't, maybe we'll just pose questions that will wander in our mind for the next couple weeks, but this is the place to practice and sharpen those skills because they can't the skills can be deployed in class, but the skills are more importantly to be deployed on your job site when you are in conflict, when you are out on the street, when you are shopping in a store, when you are, when a political campaign is trying to get you to support it, to be able to pull out these skills and say, wait a minute, these are all the questions you asked, but these are all the questions you didn't ask. What are the reasons why we can't have conversations about, and then fill in the blank of whatever is taboo or whatever the powers that be won't allow you to speak about.
Thank you. I really like that idea of the classroom as a practice session or a rehearsal space for the
Yeah.
work that you're gonna do outside in your real life. 'Cause
Yeah.
that's not particularly when we're talking about, like, a college classroom, that is a very limited amount of time. You spend a little bit more time in primary and secondary classrooms than you do in the
Yeah.
college classroom, right? So you need to be able but it's a training ground, so really
Yep.
thinking about how this prepares you to do that work other places, I
Well,
think is an
I mean,
important explicit reminder.
when I think about the Black radical tradition in this specific case, I don't know if you ever taught in high school, because I know you come out of education, but when you teach it, our curriculum is provincially mandated.
Mm,
So when I got a chance to write, I was on the writing team for a grade 12 equity studies course. Like this was like 15 years ago. And I learned the process and contributed to creating a course about equity. And this is before we had the language of diversity and inclusion, but it was just called equity studies. I found that part of my role and the heritage that we come out of in the Black radical tradition is that I couldn't just be a state worker. I could not just teach kids, this is what you need to become a mechanic. This is what you need to become an accountant. That was not going, I knew from my lived experience that that was not going to provide Black people with the sense of enjoyment, the freedom and the joy that we must constantly struggle and fight for.
mhm,
You know, when you're racialized as Black in the workplace, when you're racialized as Black in the classroom, and all these other places, we can't just be I can't just give them a linear curriculum from the state and say, now that you know these things, go get a job and buy a lot of stuff and live happily ever after when we know that, you know, um, the 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 ground is uneven for us and whatever success happens in whatever arena does not necessarily correlate to a reduction in anti-Black racism, and we know that. So I think that's what I take into the classroom pedagogically, and I feel really, really strong. Like I feel strongly about that in terms of just because you are employed by your state or in your case a state, in my case a province, it does not mean that we need to follow some linear path and suggest that all things being equal, if you do these things, then you get a job. Well, getting a job is great, and we all need them to feed ourselves. But how do you negotiate anti-Black racism in your job site when they tell you that your natural hair is not professional? Or they say, oh, you're from this part of the city, so you must act this way or believe these certain things. So I think those are the kind of tools that when we talk about the hidden curriculum and we talk about teachers' expectations impacting students and the teacher's behavior, for me, the hidden curriculum is thinking about how do I get Black life to survive what I know will be an onslaught in the labor market, where questions of anti-Black racism will be everywhere, and you may not have the tools to understand the uneven geographies of just trying to make a life in a place that still wants you to be disposable, extractable labor.
And that definitely connects back to what you were saying about so much learning happening outside the classroom, right? Like a lot of those lessons, those how to survive in the labor market, how to survive the microaggressions or the macroaggressions that happen
Yeah,
in broader society are not taught in the classroom. Like the skill set that state and national governments emphasize in education are not necessarily the same skill sets that are needed to survive in society as a Black person, um, regardless of location. And all of those and being able to emphasize and bring those is really reflective of, how Marable talks about Black studies being prescriptive, descriptive, and directive. Like, there are things that have to happen,
yeah.
um, and we have to pay attention to and notice in the work that we do. It's not enough to just, as you said, teach somebody how to be an accountant. You need to understand how to survive, um,
Yeah.
and what we can do to help to change society to make it more survivable for someone else.
I think that's why a lot of reasons why at the very basic level, I force my students to learn how to ask good questions. And what is the difference in a good question and a bad question? And help them be help it not help the answer not arrive as if we are living in a digital era where you get your answers immediately. Sit
Mm,
there and struggle with all the possibilities that one question can offer. And when I'm in my classroom now, like I'll be teaching about streaming or we're teaching about sampling or some other aspect of the music industry, and not and pushing back against the desire to have an easy answer right away, because we're not going to develop the critical faculties if the answers are given to us because the questions are given to us. So I feel like in my classroom, if I was to spend more time thinking about pedagogy and how sort of my teaching is informed by Black studies and the Black radical tradition, I would think about all of the things that aren't allowed to enter the classroom and why they're not there. For example, maybe within the last 5 or 6 years, I've been I spent about 8 years in banking, which helped fund my graduate studies, and I learned about ROE and all of the ways that banks make their $20 billion.
yeah.
Um, wasn't part of my job, but I was just reading on the job, staying interested, studying, right? A kind of study. Um, and what became really, really clear to me, I think, in was about financial knowledge and the refusal to have young people develop financial knowledge before they enter the labor market. So when after I left the bank I was still paying attention a little bit to like when the government develops a financial instrument and what that means. So we have this financial instrument called a registered education savings plan, which is not a tax deductible, but it's a place for you to store money that pays tax up front, but when you gather your compound interest over a bunch of years, you don't pay tax when you pay for your child's education. This financial tool is about expanding the university beyond all measures because it allows people to put money somewhere and pay for their. So they're developing a mechanism to help people expand the university, right? But what they're not offering us, especially at the high school level, is offering young people the tools to ask the questions of, well, how come these mutual funds are only invested in high performing companies that also are practicing fracking and other kinds of extractive practices? So, probably around 2015 or 2016 was the first time a bank that I knew of, when I asked at the bank, they're like, oh, there's no clean funds yet. There's no, I'm like, tell me a fund where you can invest your money in which the supply chain is clean, right? So EV batteries, supply chain's not clean. The amount of pollution that it takes to get the minerals out of the Congo, it's a mess. Why are we not offering 15 and 16-year-olds an opportunity to think critically about the development of mutual funds and why we can't have ethical mutual funds and why that's a new invention? When mutual funds have been around for 100 years almost. So those are the questions that don't come into the classroom, and that's where we need to begin training our young people to be like, wait a minute, why can't I learn about the financialization tools that the government develops, or why can't we learn about cleansing mutual fund supply chains? You know what I mean? About anyone that opens a mutual fund, you'll be like, look inside, you'll see 60 different companies, and none of those companies are indexed according to how they impact the environment. This is something probably in the last 10 years or 6 or 7 years that is now beginning to happen. Man, we could have been training some 15-year-olds to think critically about these things generations ago, right? But we don't. Anyhow.
No, I think that that's very important. The asking the questions and being trained to ask critical questions, especially right now with the ease at which you can get answers to questions, regardless
Yeah,
of whether or not those answers are complete or accurate. Um, the ability to ask a question and then have it answered in a way that sounds plausible. Um, yeah, I'm still really thinking through AI and the role that AI is going to have to play in different spaces that I operate in, because there isn't much of an option at this point. But the ways in which there is a distinct lack of training people as a whole to think critically and ask critical questions, and not just ask the questions, but go do the work to try to find the answer, even if an answer is not attainable. Because as you said
yeah,
before, sometimes it's not about the answer, it's about the question.
yeah. It's about the question. It's also about the process of searching for an answer to that question. That process, it's like when you misplace something in your home and you look everywhere for that thing and it's never where you think you put it, but then you find five other things that you were looking for 2 weeks ago when you're looking. It feels like exactly the same way, for me when I think about that. But yeah.
Okay, so I got 2 questions left, and then
Yeah.
I will give you back the rest of your Monday. So what interests you most about the past of Black studies? And you can also speak to hip hop studies,
Mm.
in both critical and excited senses.
I think what interests me most about Black studies is the idea of Black study in the past. And I'm thinking about the amount of Panthers and other folks on campus that weren't enrolled in school, but were there to read and study.
Mhm.
Um, and to me, that is the epitome of it, not the epitome, but I would say it's an important node in the history of Black study to think about the role of the university in providing access, and now the role of the university in shaping the path and that access going forward with the formalization of these departments. Um, I think so. What's interesting to me is like, where are the histories of Black study, and how do we share these things? How do we access, you know, the ways that people are studying Black life outside of academic or an educational institution? You know, um, when it comes to thinking about, that's what interests me about that moment. But what excites me is that it's not exciting yet, but I think we're going to get to the point where study groups will return and where people will have physical books in their hand and we will spend time together. It's happening in music right now, right?
Mhm.
So there's a generation of young people that want to hold music. They want to sit together and they want to listen to it. I imagine and I pray and hope that we're going to get to this moment where everyone that wants to read that book is going to come with the book in their hand and we're going to sit together and read something or argue over something or think about its possibilities, and to be able to have Glissant in one hand and Carol Boyce Davies in another hand, and thinking across different continents and even across some linguistic barriers. And Glissant has a lot of work in English, translated in English, but be able to be like, have these physical copies. I mean, it is still it's an honor to be able to hold some of these texts
Yeah.
and to walk with them, to work with them, to have them at your bedside, to struggle with them. I think we're past the point of digital saturation because, as you say, everything is available all the time. So all of it means nothing, right? And what will mean something in conversations like this, it'll be like when we're in the same room one day you might have like you know, 25 people from your podcast in the same room together. Those will matter way more than the answers that we're able to scrape off the internet. What we have for lunch that day, what we talk about as we walk to the lunch place, those things are going to matter. So I'm excited about the Black Studies Summer Seminar that, it's I participated in Toronto and in Kingston, Ontario. It's a partnership between the University of Toronto, Scarborough, and Queen's University. I'm excited for that because it is about being together and convening space, holding space, but also offering these moments of collision and conversation, uh, sometimes inside the university, but also on the street as we walk somewhere, on the subway as we, go to an art exhibition, in all these other places. So, it's exciting for me to think about how we will wrestle with Black studies and Black study in this. It feels like a renewed moment, you know, um, probably since, the middle of the 2010s, a renewed moment where we can talk more fulsomely about Black study and think across Canada. We have Black studies programs that are popping up. And what's great about um, that's great in and of itself, but it's not the only means by which Black study is happening. And I think that's important too, because we started the Black Study Summer Seminar um, because we're both positioned in the university and we were developing Black studies programs, but in many ways it's not tied to the curriculum of the university. And it amplifies and brings into focus more than the syllabi and the professors and the metrics that go along with the institutionalization of Black studies. It is more about pulling together a cohort of people that want to. This year, we struggled around the question of digital capture, evading digital capture, and what it means. What is Black life doing beyond the algorithm, and thinking about how do we build tools going forward around praxis? Because there's great work happening, and sometimes it's in visual art, sometimes it's in geography, sometimes it's in I'm thinking of Andre Brock's work, and sometimes it's on about a digital platform that in many ways is at the end of its relevancy, Twitter. I'm thinking specifically, and how do we reap those tools that people have been developing to evade digital capture? So I'm excited about those things. I'm excited about how we're going to wrestle with Black study um, and force new generations to imagine beyond the institutionalization of Black studies. Because in some ways, we're fortunate to not across Canada to have it not institutionalized as it's slowly coming, but that doesn't stop any of us from doing the work together in whatever way that we can.
Thank you. I think that the in person, the physical copy, like I think that's such an important component, especially right now. Um, and in the US where, there is an attack on Black studies in a way that many departments are being dissolved or absorbed or defunded. And so that work, as you said, when you had Panthers who were on campus, not enrolled as students, like you had people, the community learning alongside um, people who were formally enrolled, and the community and students pushing for the curriculum to reflect them and their lives and the things that were important to them and the study of Black life. Like that in-person study of Black life that may not be supported or sanctioned or recognized by the institution is going to be so increasingly important. Um,
Yeah.
so thank you for that. Anything else you'd like to add?
I think I talked a lot. This is a lot of talking for me. So, I mean, I could continue, but if you have other questions for me, I'm happy to jump on another topic.
Well,
Uh,
I can give you back the rest of your day, but I do appreciate um your generosity in the answers that you provided. And I think that you brought up a lot of really important points that I know I'll be thinking about for a long time. So I really
like
appreciate
what?
your contribution.
What
Well,
will you be thinking about for a long time?
I think that, well, just recently, the point about having those in-person spaces and thinking, I hadn't thought as much about like the digital evasion aspect of it, right? But the importance of having that, the way that things have been planned, the way that movements and strategies and survival tactics um, have largely been in-person endeavors.
Yeah.
Um, and we live in a world now where it is so digitally saturated that there's so much that gets put on platforms that are accessible globally when they're not being censored, but like that are accessible globally to a large extent. But you can't necessarily do that, right? Like we have to get back to in-person conversations. You have to have um a level of invisibility in order to
Mm,
accomplish some of the work that's going to need to be done moving forward.
yeah.
Um so that's one thing I'm thinking about. I'm going to think about how the classroom as rehearsal or as practice, like what that might mean for the ways in which I approach my teaching. Um, and emphasizing to students the importance of actually doing the work and thinking critically and not
Mhm.
relying on the ease of access to information, regardless of the quality of that information. Um, in as we ramp up with more and more AI being integrated and universities designing centers on AI and investing a lot of money into
Yeah.
AI moving forward because, we have this juxtaposition between defunding and lack of money and not as high as enrollment in some places. And then we're still going to invest millions and millions and sometimes billions of dollars into AI. So the money is there, but
Mhm.
they're being very selective about where the money can go. Um, yeah. So those are some of the things I'm gonna keep thinking about.
Okay. I'm so glad you invited me, and I appreciate this work that you and John are doing with this podcast. It is accessible. I love it. Um, but it offers the field so much. So thank you for that. It's not. I think I heard John say you guys record Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, like 3 times a week or something.
That's when we
Super.
drop. We drop Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.
Oh, that's when
We
you
do a
drop.
lot.
Okay. That is a lot. Yeah. I don't know if it, yeah, it's just if it's sustainable, but I mean, please sustain it. If you can do one per week, that's totally fine. Like, that's a lot, you know?
Yeah, I at some point it'll probably change, but
Mm,
as long as amazing people who are doing Black studies work
mhm.
continue to agree to talk to us, we plan on continuing to do the podcast. And I know for me personally, it has just been I've probably learned more doing the podcast than I did in grad school. Like, it's just been
Amazing.
such an amazing learning experience for me. And it's also been really, really amazing to be able to talk to, like, people I've been citing for 20 years in a way that I
Yeah.
didn't think that I would. So I'm really appreciative of you and all of our other guests who agreed to have these conversations with us.
Yeah. Well, keep going. Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. You have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.